Welcome to another episode of Art Heals All Wounds. I'm your host, Pam Uzel. On this show, we meet artists transforming lives with their work. Once upon a time, there was a magical place full of beautiful princesses, and they wore the most beautiful gowns you could possibly imagine, with bows and sequins and lace. From their perfectly coiffed hair to their elegantly manicured hands, down to the tips of their high-heeled shoes, they were the fairest in the land. Handsome princes came from all around to hear these princesses sing and to watch their graceful dancing. This magical land I'm talking about was, of course, Esta Noche. Esta Noche, a Latino gay bar, hosted some of the most memorable drag performances in the San Francisco Bay Area. I first went to Esta Noche as a very young woman. I remember in particular Marisela. Silky black hair, red lips, long fluttering lashes, full of smiles for her throngs of admirers. When I saw Marisela, I thought, she is one of the most beautiful women I have ever seen. That night, as I was leaving Esta Noche, I stopped in the bathroom. I remember looking at myself in the mirror and thinking, I really need to up my game. Many years later, a friend invited me to come to her partner's performance as a drag king. The first thing I thought of was Marisela and Esta Noche. I was really curious to see a performance of masculinity in the same way that I had seen these amazing performances of femininity. When I saw the performance of my next guest, Cassandra Falby, as drag king Brock Cocker, I was not disappointed. Besides being a drag king, Cassandra Falby is also a psychotherapist. I've always imagined that being a psychotherapist would require great powers of observation and a lot of insight. I think these abilities are what served Cassandra so well in creating and performing as a drag king. When I saw Cassandra perform as Brock Cocker, everything about Brock, from the square of his shoulders and the manly strut and a very lush mustache, Brock was every crazy crush I'd ever had. In her interview, Cassandra talks about how she developed Brock as her drag king alter ego. We also discuss the hopefully increased visibility of drag kings within popular culture. You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. First up, the art of conversation. You can get more information about this podcast and get in touch with me on the Facebook page, Art Heals All Wounds, and on Twitter and Instagram at Art Heals Podcast. So a week or so ago, I read an interview with Sinead O'Connor, the singer who blazed into pop stardom in the late 80s and early 90s. She's probably most well known for her version of Nothing Compares to You, a song written by Prince, which was released in 1990. I love that song, but her first album, The Lion and the Cobra, that was released a few years before that, was the soundtrack of my life for most of my senior year in college. My roommate and I literally wore that record out. Some of you probably remember that O'Connor effectively ended her pop career when she tore up a picture of the Pope at the end of a performance on Saturday Night Live. She then became pretty much the fodder of tabloids due to an ongoing struggle with mental health. O'Connor has written a memoir that will be released in the next week or so. Writing this memoir gives her the opportunity to tell her story from her perspective. It also gives us a chance to reevaluate our perception of her and the media's treatment of her. It's really interesting. We absolutely love to put female pop stars way up on a pedestal, but what we seem to love even more is to then viciously tear them down. I'm wondering, why do we do this to young women? Obviously misogyny, but more specifically, What kind of primitive urge in our society is this practice fulfilling for us? What do you think? I would love if someone out there has any theories or thoughts on this, if you would write to me on Facebook or Instagram and let me know your thoughts. Up next, our deep dive with this episode's guest on Art Heals All Wounds. You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. Listen and let us inspire you. The other day, I was telling a friend that every day in high school, I got up 2 hours before I had to leave for school. The reason I did was because each morning I showered, shaved my legs and underarms, and washed my hair. Then I blew my hair dry. Then I put it up in hot rollers. While the hot rollers were doing their thing, I started on my makeup. First there was foundation, then blush, then eyeshadow, then eyeliner, then mascara. Then I took the hair down from the hot rollers and sprayed it so that my curls wouldn't immediately melt in the humidity. And then a final blend of the makeup on my face so that it would look as natural as possible. She was laughing hysterically at this. To anyone who does a similar routine every morning, I'm not criticizing you at all. What's funny about me doing this every morning is that it's so unlike me. It's just that almost every other girl in my high school did the same thing to get ready for school. And I didn't really understand that any of this was in any way optional. My understanding was that that's what you did if you were a girl in this southern town. Actually, that's untrue. What I believed was that that's what you did if you were a girl. This was just one of the things on my mind during my conversation with my next guest, Cassandra Falby. Cassandra's performed as drag king Brock Cocker for over 10 years now. This experience of performing masculinity and creating a character who has a lot of flexibility on the gender spectrum has helped her to expand her own comfort zone in the expression of her gender. Hi, Cassandra. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Art Heals All Wounds. Can you start off just by telling us a little bit about yourself? We're going to talk about your drag king persona and your performance in that way, but there's a lot more about you.
Sure, Pam, and thank you so much for having me. So I am a drag king, semi-retired, I might say, and my drag king's name is Brock Cocker. I have not really been able to, definitely since the pandemic and a little before. Brock has not been out and about, but Brock does always live within me. In addition to being a drag king and doing performance in that way, I am also a psychotherapist, and I have a private practice in Oakland, California. And also a little sidebar as well. I've been known to do comedy, stand-up comedy. So those are some of the domains that I inhabit, and they bring me joy. I enjoy doing them.
Well, so first of all, I'm really sad to hear that Brock is semi-retired. I hope that the emphasis is on semi. I'm wondering if you can tell us the story. How did you decide to start performing as a drag king, and where did this persona of Brock Cocker come from?
I firmly believe that I was destined to be a theater kid, but never truly realized that part of me. And I did, performance, did piano, violin, those types of things, but nothing in the way of performing on stage or performing in front of people, acting things out. Things like that. Yeah. So, for me, Brock, actually, I had another persona before Brock, very short-lived. And he was born in San Francisco, and his name was Gus D. Windy. Yeah, just be with that. And then I wanted to have, Gus was someone who was he was a straight guy about town. He was from the Midwest. Brock is also from the Midwest. So Gusty Windy was from like the Chicago area. So he was also Midwestern. But there was something about it that I didn't feel like I could Gus didn't fully realize all the things that I wanted a character to be. So I created Brock. And Brock was more fun-loving than Gus. More of a people person. I think I lean more at times toward being slightly introverted. So Brock is not that person. Brock loves people, loves animals, loves life. He's very much that person. Brock is pansexual. Brock is all things all the time. He's a people magnet. So I think in some ways, I think with characters that people develop, the character in some ways is a part of what that person wants to be, or just wants to kind of be that partially. There's a part of them. So I think that there's definitely some overlap between Brock and I, but Brock is definitely braver than I am. Brock has a little more courage than I do.
Wow. So that's fascinating. But this still doesn't really, there might be a lot of different ways to perform. And so what had you seen about drag kings? What was it that attracted you to performing as a drag king?
I really liked this idea of playing with gender. And I had always been, I think for me, it was an extension in some ways of ways that I had played with gender earlier in my life, even into childhood, ways that I occupied gender. And, back when I was, a kid, things were much more rigid, way more rigid than they are now in terms of things that boys could do and girls could do. And I really felt constricted and restrained by what some of those limitations were at that time. And I think in some ways I really like the idea of being able to be a little more free, a little more expansive with gender in ways that felt comfortable to me, in ways that perhaps I might not be able to try something out and see if it fit for me. And finding that the more I tried it on, and the more I tried the costumes on figuratively and literally, they were all quite comfortable. So
what sort of things felt comfortable to you when you were trying on Brock's costume?
Well, for sure, I was able to play a little more. It gave me a space to kind of try out different ties, different types of shirts and so forth. And really, where Brock and I overlap is that Brock is still feminine. Brock has those elements. So Brock loves a good, dangly earring. Brock loves a nice scarf. Brock loves glitter, sequins, sparkles. This is all part of the way to play. And I think that Brock tries to maximize joy. I think that those are things that bring Brock joy. And also those are things that bring me joy. And I think as part of, my process and also his development and his kind of growing up, kind of his growth, is that there are definitely ways that there could be a drag king didn't have to be masculine. And I think once I got to a place where I discovered that, then I was all in. I was like, well, Brock doesn't wear them now because Brock's, has certain limitations, but Brock has a delightful pair of silver glitter, like 6-inch heels that Brock used to wear, right? Like, so those are the things that I think felt very freeing. So there was more space and more room to kind of create different narratives, and that both Brock and I can find joy in the development of those narratives.
I've seen you perform twice as Brock, and the performances were very different. The first performance I would say, followed along what you were describing as sort of this softer side of Brock. But the second time was what I think of in my head is almost like a semi-striptease that Brock did, where Brock was wearing I think they were jeans with chaps, or was it just jeans?
You are correct.
Jeans with chaps?
They were jeans that had a little flourish down the side. Yes.
Yeah. Well, they had, I think, snaps, right?
They did. You have a good memory, Pam. You have a good memory.
Well, I'll never forget this because it was one of the best things I've ever seen. At the end of, this one, Brock was very masculine in this particular performance. He was dressed as a cowboy. And what was interesting is that when I watched that one especially, I almost forgot about you, Cassandra, because Brock was so fully this person who he was kind of strutting in this very flirtatious and masculine way. And I almost feel like that Brock was wearing cowboy boots. Is that true?
Yes, I think, I have to think back, but yeah.
And at the end of the thing, he yanks these jeans with snaps off, and he's wearing tidy whities underneath is my memory. Maybe I've embellished it in my memory. But everything about the walk, the glances, everything was this very flirtatious male stripper in a way. And very kind of that, again, if we're talking about performance, this really performance of machismo that was really, it was very adorable. He was like a very sexy man in that particular one. So Brock did have many different sides to him. And as I said, I'll never forget it because it was just so good. It was so surprising and so both funny and endearing. And I absolutely had a crush on Brock after that. So that's another reason why I'm sad that he is semi-retired. So how did you, I'm really curious to know, how do you come up with what these performances and this idea of okay, well, I'm going to perform as Brock Cocker. So what is this going to be about? How do you think of those things?
So, well, thank you for that was a nice walk down memory lane. That was good. I'm kind of chuckling at that. Yeah. So, I kind of look at kind of how I would frame out or used to frame out performance sometimes is with drag performance with three kind of components. I mean, there are many components, but I kind of see it as kind of a triangle. And one part is, if it's kind of standard drag, you're performing to a song. One part is music. One part is your costume or your outfit. And then the other part is your choreography. So kind of thinking about those three sides of a triangle, if you will. And so there can be one part that motivates. So it could be I have this particular choreography that I think would be interesting to do, and to see what are the other two pieces that mesh nicely with that. And in this case, with this particular piece, it was a song. So I'm a Billy Ocean fan. It was Billy Ocean. And that particular song, I thought it would be interesting. It's a song that I was listening to a lot at that time. And I thought, it would be really interesting for Brock to kind of do this and actually be
a cowboy, but like what would that be? What would that look like? And like what would he be doing? And so forth. So that was something that came out of a song, right? So it's from the song, then it's kind of thinking about what would the costume be? And it's like, okay, we're going to do cowboy. So we have those two components. And then what would the choreography be? So it's bringing those three parts together. And generally that's how I think about performance. But there's usually one piece, one of those three that takes the lead, and then it forms the other two.
Brock just sort of owned that crowd.
And this is going to sound odd, perhaps not, but what Brock was doing, that is not me, right? Like, so there's a way where there's almost, when we talk about kind of this idea too in therapy too, as depersonalization. So there's a way where that, when I think back, way back to that time, I think about how that was, it's a part of me, but then there's a way that I'm both inhabiting it and it's I'm stepping away from it, which is this interesting mix. And I think it's shifting, like it's constantly, I'm constantly moving between those two spaces. And I also think that there's something about, even just with general clothing removal, even just a piece, that people respond to that, right? Like, so it could just be, depending on your crowd, it could be taking off a sock, or you see people who maybe are removing a garter, right? Like people go, it really plays with something that people like, which is anticipation. And anticipation, playing that game, that's the anticipation is something that leaves people in a place where it's like, ooh, what's next? What are we doing? What's next? What's next? Where are we going? Show me. Yeah. So, I think that, thinking back to also the costume that Brock was wearing, I think it's, again, it's something that you would never see me, Cassandra. It's not something I would wear.
No, I've never seen you wear anything.
You've never seen, right? Like ever. But there's a way that when Brock puts that on, regardless of what the costume is, the outfit, the clothing, the material, that he's just going to make it work. He's bold in that way. And like I said, I find that he is another, he's courageous in ways that I think at times I wish I could be.
But that's so interesting, because it seems like if you've had this experience that you're describing, where you can you're both there present, but you also step away and you allow this other thing to come through. It seems like you could kind of take that into other aspects of your life.
I appreciate that question, Pam. It's interesting because it seems that it would just flow, right? It seems, but there's almost like a transition, a kind of moving into it's like a mindset. So even for, even as Brock is, if I'm going to be, thinking back to, performing, as Brock's preparing to kind of go on, there's actually like a shifting. It's almost like a superhero, but there's this shift that happens where I am almost less myself and more him, right? There's a way that I become, as it gets closer to when I'm performing, I become less myself, not in a bad way. It's just kind of like, Brock's going to need this body to do what he needs to do. Okay, go ahead. I'm patient. I'm patient. So it's all good. And it's all in, expression of joy or just expression of a feeling. Sometimes it hasn't always been joy, but most of the time it has been, and it's allowing for this even deeper expression of feeling, of a message, of a certain internal experience that Brock wants to show. Brock wants to offer that and welcome people into his world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then I want to go back to one other thing you talked about, which I thought was really interesting, which is that being Brock allows you to explore some things about gender that you maybe didn't get to explore as a child. You mentioned that it was very strict in those days. Did you ever feel like, oh, I really want to do this particular masculine thing as a kid and you weren't allowed to?
I've been thinking about this a lot, actually, kind of thinking about these different, childhood and adolescence and young adulthood and how these phases, how they were punctuated by gender. Mm-hmm. And I definitely have multiple times that I can remember as a child where the message I got was that, oh, girls don't do that. Like, I was like, I know you got me, I know I'm like 4 and you got me this like little bikini, this little bikini thing. But what I'm going to let you know is I'm not wearing this top. I'm just trying to be like him. That's what I'm trying to do. Right.
Yes.
Right. Like, that's what I'm trying to do. Or even how I might want to sit and how I want to be. And I mean, even, I remember one time I got reprimanded for not sitting in a way that was becoming of a lady. Yeah. So I couldn't, and that's something that I was thinking about recently. But what I love, and one of the things that I feel I have more access to is Brock's existence has allowed me to feel more expansive in my own gender presentation, like all sorts of things that feel comfortable to me. And, and in terms of identity and what does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a man, masculine, feminine, those types of things. And, has even really has me more in a non-binary. That's, kind of being, identifying more as non-binary as I'm, kind of looking at what feels right to me, and kind of, sometimes I feel, more feminine, and I'm femme-identified. So that part is pretty static for me. My femme identity is, but how I, kind of how I am in the world, how I present, that can have a fluidity that doesn't kind of disturb that feminist for me. Mm-hmm. So, and for me, my femme identity is, pretty rooted. What the process and what Brock's presence has done is it's just kind of created more space for there to be kind of more joy, more magic, more like just teasing things apart. Sometimes more fun, because like I told you, he loves it. Brock loves a good time. And I think the fun, the kind of the fun nature, he identifies as a butch queen. So that's kind of where he inhabits, that's kind of how he is. And that's his being and his identity.
So, Cassandra, one thing that I wonder about is that I've heard of drag queens much more than I've heard of drag kings. And I think a lot of people would say the same thing. Why is that?
Well, I don't know for sure, of course, but I have my thoughts. I think there are a variety of things that, that impact why drag queens are more prevalent than drag kings. I think it's multi-layered. I think that it has to do with, on a certain level, it has to do with misogyny. I think that it has to do with a fear of the feminine, or just kind of the value of the feminine. I think it also depends on who has access to media. I think that's a part of it as well. I think there's also some part of it that has to do with how free people feel to access specific ways of kind of performing or doing gender. I think those are some of the things that come into play.
When you say misogyny by who? Because what's so interesting about drag is that you have men performing as women and women performing as men, and then some non-binary people also in there. Is it misogyny on the part of male performers? Is it the larger context of misogyny in our culture? What exactly is the misogyny that you're talking about?
I'm really talking about, I mean, I think there are different ways you can go, obviously, with that question. But I think for the sake of our conversation today, I'm focusing on kind of more cultural misogyny. For individuals who want to, regardless of gender, want to perform or engage with femininity, it's seen as I think, I'll speak in broad brush terms. It's historically these things are seen as less valuable. So we're talking about, oftentimes women's labor, things that women do, they don't necessarily have as much value. And I think for some people, there may be questions about, well, let's say, talking about drag queens, if you decide to do heels, like some people think that heels are ridiculous. And some people extrapolate that, well, heels are ridiculous, but also women are ridiculous. I think that what drag queens do is they actually highlight some of the fun and the joy that can be part of these things, and kind of shine a light on it in a different way, I think. And there's some people who really appreciate that and love that and value it and want to join in the joy, want to be a part of the fun. And then there are also folks, historically, who just don't understand why would you want to wear a dress, wear earrings, wear jewelry. These things don't make sense. And I'm talking specifically in a Western context, so focusing on that. But really kind of, why would you want to adorn your body in this way? Why do you see value in these things that are inherently, they don't have value? If we kind of go down to the basics, wearing a man wearing a dress versus women wearing pants. You think if we just go out into the world, talking about Western culture, how often do you see one of those and how often do you see the other? And when men are doing drag, when they're drag queens, they're not doing that in a way where there's shame, because, historically there's been shame attached to these things. There's been, vilification for wearing women's clothing and what that means. And people beaten, harmed, arrested, killed for these things. And so I think that there's the weight of that. And I think, and to some degree, it's, for drag kings, it might just be seen as like, oh, look, dressing up like men. Isn't that nice? Isn't that sweet? Isn't that cute? I think there can be almost a kind of a demonization of that. And I think what drag kings try to do is show that there is variation, that there are different ways of performing, that there is joy, that there can be fun, and also performing what their experience of either masculinity is, because not all drag kings are masculine. Like Brock's not necessarily the most masculine person, but he is a drag king.
Right.
So it's also getting in there and playing with gender as well. But I think those are some of the factors. And I think it also is who has access to the resources to create spaces where these things occur, and also where the interest is in that. Like, who's interested in doing those types of things. I mean, I love seeing drag kings perform in the variation, and I'm always excited about some of the new folks. Like there's out of Southern California, there's Landon Sider, who is really fantastic. Over in the UK, there's Adam Mall. Adam Mall's fantastic. I mean, there's some really great folks. There are other folks as well that I haven't named. There's just a ton of folks. And I think that there's a new way of doing drag that is demonstrating that it's not a two-dimensional way of performing, that that there can be fun and playfulness in drag and being a drag king.
Yeah. One thing that appeals to me about drag kings is that in this performance of masculinity, there's such a wide range, and there are so many things that you can celebrate and enjoy within this context of performance that maybe in your relationship or in your workplace or something would not be something that you would celebrate. Like, you can really see a performance of machismo that's very, very fun to watch as a performance, whereas you might not experience it as fun in your daily life. There was recently this article in the New York Times that said sort of like, keep an eye on these drag kings. Do you feel like it might become more well known?
Well, that's my hope. My hope is that it's an upward trajectory. I also wanted to respond to something that you just said related to kind of real life versus drag, and both are kind of performances, right, of masculinity. That with drag, the same way with drag queens, there's often like the playfulness that I talked about. There's often kind of like with drag kings, it's poking holes in masculinity. So in some ways, like that's different than real life, because it's showing up as this thing that is perhaps more rigid. It's not flexible. Whereas there's a way that with performance, when you add the creativity into that it's machismo, but it's oftentimes it's play with that. It's kind of a way to engage with it differently than perhaps its meaning in the outside world, in the lived world, where there are all of these other things that are, it's theater in a way, but there's so much more riding on it out in the real world.
Right. That is a really great point. But that is coming back to your character, Brock Cocker. Mm-hmm. That's part of what I really love about him, is that you said he's not the most masculine person, but at times he does take on some of the more machismo things, and you're able to blend this portrait of someone where you're playing with both sides, a more feminine side of the spectrum and a more masculine side. And I really like that combination in him, in his character.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's kind of, it allows for more of, rather than it being, right, we talk about gender binaries, it allows for this spectrum, this flexibility. And I think that while there's some people that are that need the binary to exist, need gender binaries to exist to feel whole, there are folks where just by the gender binary existing, people feel limited. They don't feel whole. They don't feel like they can be themselves. They feel that they have only partial access to who they want to be, whether that's a character or people just in real time, in real life, lived experiences. So
it is so layered because of our culture, because of the nature of the performance. There's a lot to sort of sort through and think about.
And just, that how different the histories are, and how there for so long, historically, there have been dedicated spaces for drag queens to perform. And a lot of that is about creating safety for chosen families, safety for being able to be yourself. And I mean, I would say, again, with misogyny, I would say that maleness or masculinity doesn't necessarily, there's no, they say like, there's no crying in baseball. There's no playing with masculinity. You cannot play with that. it is, in some ways, it sits as this thing that needs to be almost untouchable. And I think that it doesn't allow for that flexibility, for that way of being. And I think that having spaces for drag queens to perform has allowed for that flexibility, for that to become something that's a culture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there is a drag king culture as well, for sure. There's definitely that. And, but I think that, I think people perhaps still are kind of fascinated on what does it mean when a man is wearing a dress. There's still something that's kind of taboo and scandalous about that for some folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see that. Again, though, I am fully behind the increased popularity of drag kings because there's so much creativity out there, and everything from the look to the, what kind of their persona is going to wear, what the hairstyle is going to be. Is there going to be like added facial hair components? And then just the bearing and the attitude. It is such a wonderful way to think about masculinity within our culture. And it is a really fun thing to go and watch something that, especially for myself, that maybe I have some ambivalence about. Maybe I don't want a machismo boyfriend, but I do find that style very sexy. You can go see a very macho drag king and just fully enjoy it. Do you know what I mean? Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that what you're saying is that there are these different ways about us as individuals where there are these, where we may not necessarily know why or may not necessarily know, but we know how we feel about it. And we know that we're interested in it. And maybe we haven't necessarily figured out the motivation, but, it's being interested in both things, being interested in a blend. But yeah, I think, it's wonderful to see, the current drag kings, the ones that I have seen. I love the kind of, exuberance that some of them have related to use of color, related to hair, related to costuming. And really I love the attention to detail. I mean, if you can get like a blazer or a vest or some type of flourish around the neck that has some sequins, I'm here for it.
Yes, definitely. If we want to find out when Brock might be performing again, how could people do that?
So, Brock has actually a Facebook page. Go figure. Yeah, Brock has a Facebook page. You can learn a little bit about him there, and anything, any performances would be listed on that page. It's been a minute, but you could even use it as an archive. There we go. To learn about him.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, and we do hope that Brock considers coming out of retirement once it's safe to perform and gather and enjoy his dance moves.
Well, I mean, I will likely, I'll say this, Pam, I will likely be seeing him sometime soon, probably today. And yeah, I'll likely see him today sometime.
Please tell him I miss him.
I certainly will do that. I'll let him know. But yeah, I'll let him know that that you'd be excited to see him return when it's safe to do so. I'll pass that message on to him.
I would. You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. Remember to be in touch on my Facebook page, Art Heals All Wounds, and also on Twitter and Instagram at Art Heals Podcast. Thank you so much to Cassandra Falby for joining me on this episode and talking about her performance as drag king Brock Cocker. If you want to learn more about Brock Cocker, you can find him on Facebook. That's BROCK, new word, COCKER. And please, if you do look him up on Facebook, urge him to come out of retirement. The music you've heard in this podcast is Yellow Light District and Autowaschenlage Instrumental by Lobo Loco. Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 15 in D major was performed by Karina Galanian.